Hello everyone, this is a short video about publishing in business history journals and a little bit about publishing business history beyond. My name is Stephanie Decker. I work at the University of Birmingham and I've been running the Organizational History Network for the past 10 years or so. I hope this is helpful to you. Just a quick note, this is based on a keynote presentation I recently delivered for the Turkish National Business History Conference. So one of the first things to consider if you're looking at publishing some business history is sort of how the field has evolved over time. This is something you may know, but if you're relatively new to the field, you may not be aware of this. Also, this is very much a way of thinking around business history that is heavily rooted in Anglophone, so in English-speaking business history. Traditionally, this has been seen as a field determined by a sort of paradigm of Chandlerian business history. Alfred Chandler is the man there on the left. Next to him, the picture of the woman is Henrietta Larson, another woman who can reasonably claim to be one of the sort of godmothers of the field. But I think it's fair to say that in the late 20th century, it was Chandler's work on large-scale businesses, particularly American, how they expanded and how they managed, that has very much determined the field. Now, around the turn of the millennium, there was a general sense that business historians were coming to the end of that particular paradigm and that they were increasingly looking at business history sui generis, effectively as a field by itself. Now, this again has been a sort of reading of business history that has become challenged in the last couple of years, and there were a couple of claims around a new business history being on the rise. Now, a few years ago, we wrote a piece that actually we needed to look at new business histories because there's more than one particular tradition that could reasonably claim to be a new form of business history. First, we listed history of capitalism, which is quite a historically oriented field, very strongly US dominated, where business historians remain employed by history departments. The article that we responded to was putting forward a claim for quantitative business history. Again, I think this is a relevant claim. There's been an increase in quantitative business history, but it's probably remained reasonably marginal within the field. And finally, where we particularly anchored our contribution was management and organizational history, which was different from business history sui generis and remains different in that it sees itself as a self-consciously interdisciplinary field that seeks to interact with the works, the research and the ideas, the theories emanating from business and management fields. And I think that highlights that when you do business history, it is worthwhile considering what your disciplinary commitments are. For a long time, business history was really seen as sort of the little brother sister to economic history. And both economic history and business history were initially in history departments, but economic historians did leave history departments, particularly in the UK, less so in continental Europe, even less so perhaps in history departments in the US. Business historians started at that point moving into the newly created business schools. Again, certainly in the UK, we see this movement though in other countries, for example, France, Italy, Japan. As I said, less so perhaps in the United States, though again, we would see quite a lot of colleagues, for example, in Canada in business and management schools. Economic historians have often gone to economics departments. Many of these economic departments are now also part of business schools. So effectively, the field that used to be heavily located in history now finds itself predominantly, that's not true for every country, but in many countries, predominantly as a subfield of business and management. And the big question really is, what does that mean for publishing? Now, the four main journals, main in the sense that they're international, but also that they're English-speaking, therefore read quite widely, are Business History Review, Business History, Enterprise and Society, and Management and Organizational History. The last one is the most recent of these journals. Now, I've bunched them here together in terms of being more history oriented or being more business oriented. I would say this is a difference by degree and by overall what they publish. It doesn't necessarily apply to every single piece in there. So all these journals remain reasonably open to a variety of contributions, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But it is perhaps fair to say that these journals have a certain tendency. Business History Review is currently edited by Jeff Jones and Walter Freeman. It is essentially managed out of a business school, but as an American journal, as we said, most of the American business historians are in history departments. It remains quite history focused, though not exclusively so. Enterprise and Society, Ai Hisano is the new editor-in-chief coming in, is owned by the Business History Conference, which is the main business historical association in the US. So again, represents the more heavily history-oriented type of scholarship. The other two journals that are more business-oriented are UK-based, and I think that very much reflects where the field is now in the UK. Business History, where I used to be an editor-in-chief, is now managed by Christina Lubinsky and Neil Mackenzie. Management Organizational History has just been taken over by Gabi Durapo and Amon Barros. Now, these two, again, would really be publishing also heavily historical work, because ultimately within the very much larger field of business, that's the USP of these journals, but they're perhaps more oriented towards social scientific ideas. So a little bit more about myself and my publishing experience. What have I learned over the years? Well, I have been a co-editor of Business History since 2013 and was editor-in-chief for 5 years. I stepped down end of last year. And I think through that I learned a lot about the field, because it's probably the largest journal, so we get a large number of submissions, and that gives you a fairly good idea of where ideas over time have drifted and who is engaging with the field. I've also published in the other journals. For example, Business History Review have published, and I've twice won the Henrietta Larson Prize for the best article in the year in that journal, so I'm very proud of that. And in Management Organizational History, one of my articles remains the second most cited article after the inaugural piece, which is The Silence of the Archives, which was a very interesting piece for me to write, because it was the first time I've written something like that. And it's been quite influential for its discussion of how historians deal with archives. I've also published in Enterprise and Society, so I feel I can argue I've got all 4 journals under my belt and a sense of what they publish, what their approaches are. And this is really what I'm basing this talk on. Now, one of the things we did as editors in Business History was to think around what kind of contributions we want in the journal, because obviously this is very common for business studies. And of course, we were getting a lot of social scientists submitting who really expect perhaps more guidance. And if the guidance isn't there, you notice that that's becoming a problem. But it's probably worthwhile discussing these types of contributions, not just for the journal Business History, because I believe they're actually really important for the entire field. Now, the aim in Business History was really to develop these types of contributions to facilitate interdisciplinarity without actually leaving the strengths of our own field behind. So a bit of a best of both worlds from being at the intersection of multiple fields. For starters, we highlighted that there are empirical contributions, and we made this very front and center because for social sciences it's very unusual to accept an empirical contribution. A historiographical contribution, which probably requires some explaining, though for historians it should be more straightforward. And a theoretical contribution, by which we actually tried to highlight that the sort of theoretical contribution we expect in these journals is indeed different from what you would normally see in a business and management journal. And this is all, if you want to read up on it, in an editorial in Business History called Taking Stock and Moving Forward, which looks a little bit at the publications in the journal over the past 10 years, but then also kind of looks forward as to what should our publication strategy look like. Now, to explain to you the different types of contributions, that will hopefully give you a bit of an idea of how the field works and how you can contribute to it more broadly. An empirical contribution is something that is based on new sources. Very often that means we talk archival sources, though it's not necessarily archival. It could also be oral history, visual or material sources, though we find these are relatively rarely used in business history, so there's actually quite a lot of opportunity to contribute through those. We focused on this first because empirical novelty really matters to business history. It is new knowledge about the past, and I think it highlights that it's really important that you know your journal or your book publishers to understand where something that is empirically novel can sit and will be appreciated in a way that's maybe not true of journals in other interdisciplinary spaces. Next, we look at historiographic contribution, and I think that's quite an important one because while these are perhaps more common in history, business historians don't necessarily have the strongest track record of looking at these. It involves engaging with research controversies in the field, and this might very much be competing narratives in history, which we consider historiographical. But given we're an interdisciplinary field, these could also be new conceptual frameworks that help to shape our understanding of business or organizational activity in the past. So, for example, taking a theoretical construct, concept, or explanation and reinterpreting the past through this theoretical idea. This can ultimately lead to challenging the existing conceptual frameworks that explain the past to us, and this is the point of a historiographic contribution. Finally, a theoretical contribution. Now, that might be something that you think you're familiar with from management journals, but for business history, that's perhaps a little bit different. Essentially, in business history, certainly, we're looking to employ historical research to contribute to relevant theories, perhaps in economics, institutional, organizational theory. That might be around rhetorical history or perhaps fairly sort of over time type theories like imprinting. But realistically, business history journals don't really look for the level of theoretical abstraction that these journals do, particularly not if that theoretical abstraction turns historical context into just a section and the rest becomes fairly ahistorical. So the point is really the theory needs to contribute new knowledge of the past, and it can make a theoretical contribution as a result, but that is not the primary focus. So if it's highly theoretical, the history just goes into one section that's called context. That's perhaps really something for a management journal that might be interested in history-informed work. That's not usually work that fits that well into business history journals. So if you are thinking about publishing business historical research, it's always worth also thinking around how can you publish beyond business history. Obviously, when it comes to, say, history, you might be looking at books. And it's always worthwhile to consider why fields like history, mainstream history, or economic history, leaning more towards economics, would be interested in certain subjects or topics. A lot of my empirical work has been on African business history, so this question always was quite front and center to everything I did because people are not necessarily inherently interested in it. And as I said, I presented this first to the Turkish Business History Association, and they were really asking about Turkish and Ottoman business history. I feel that is a similar situation where realistically the context, the regional focus, potentially offers interesting insights, and feels like history and economic history, which are inherently more interested in bringing in, say, a regional focus that is under-researched, that can be a really good pitch. On the other hand, if you want to move further into business and management, say into fields like strategy, international business, entrepreneurship, business ethics, organization studies, all of these have been known to publish business history. Also, I would say like family business, quite close to entrepreneurship, but somewhat separate. What you find here is that this idea of a regional focus or an area we haven't worked on is perhaps less compelling. Here, really what you want to work with is, can you contribute to the theory through a new context? Does that bring novelty? Are there new forms of organization or new dynamics that perhaps the old theories do not fully explain? That's a way of bringing your very, or likely very specific focus in business history into those fields. And finally, I wanted to reflect briefly on something that maybe you've seen on the internet. It's the Japanese concept of ikigai. Ikigai is often seen as the reason for being, the meaning of life, but I thought for a long time around what is actually the Ikigai of scholarly publishing, because of course sometimes it can be quite a drag, so it really helps to think around what keeps you interested as a scholar. So I've sort of here taken it as a reason for being an academic, for being research active, for trying to publish. And Ikigai has these 4 circles, which I reinterpreted into scholarly publishing. Starting at the top, it's really around what you love to write about. And very often, how does this perhaps relate to the world and what the world needs to know more about? And if you can obviously overlap these 2 circles, that's sort of the dream. But realistically, we often think around what can you get published in good journals? And very often the editors may say what they want is all these things that the world needs to know more about, and this is what you get published in a good journal. Whether that is always entirely true, I think sometimes we have to take that with a pinch of salt. And ultimately, the 4th circle is really around what gets cited and recognized by your peers. So if it's in a good journal and it gets cited, that's clearly where academic success lies. But if you also are able to write the stuff you love writing and that gets cited and recognized, that sounds almost like it's too easy, or maybe it's some sort of myth. And I think the real challenge is how do we move from these different circles and the overlaps into the center of the 4 circles. And sometimes it may feel like this is the preserve of a few rockstar academics. Nevertheless, I think it's helpful to think around which of these things maybe you've nailed, or which of these things you want to start with, and where perhaps you might want to compromise a bit to sort of understand what your publishing strategy should be looking like in the future. Now, what works where? Because realistically, if you're in an interdisciplinary field, the thing that works well for one audience most likely will tank for another. And that's one of the really frustrating things, because you feel like you're forever learning, and you never come out of the cycle of learning. Now, I think in a small field, and business history realistically is a small field, you'll always see that there is a struggle around making audience interested in the subject, the issues that small fields want to research. Now, I find business history is inherently quite empirical and sometimes also a bit imperial. So the fact that they like to hear about, say, Turkish or African business history is also, we haven't looked at subject XYZ in that place. And I think that's a little bit of a, let's fill the white spaces on the map. But whether that necessarily always advances knowledge in quite the way we would like, I think that's a different question. Now, if you're looking at the new business history, and particularly historical research and business and management, really I think you want to go with a pitch more that you can develop new theory from new empirical settings, bearing in mind that the past is also a new empirical setting. Now, for management organizational history in particular, I feel a focus on different organizational forms and legacies in different contexts is a really good way of positioning a lot of that research. Though, we're talking about very broad positioning here, and you will have to focus this much more closely on the things you're actually interested in. And finally, I think there's also a bit of a question to be asked around what kind of research are you doing? In business history journals, we often assume archival research is basically the norm. So you don't really have to justify it very much. Whereas if you use oral history, you will need greater explanation, especially if you're using it exclusively. And it's worthwhile highlighting that oral history isn't like this fantastically newfangled, amazing thing. It's been a field in history for a long time, and it's worthwhile reading and citing oral history and using that and applying it to business historical pieces. Management journals are a little different in that I would say, while archives perhaps have become more acceptable, they're still not fully understood, and they often require explanation. It really depends which audience you talk to. Say organization studies, some of the general management crowd, they may have gotten more used to it. If you talk to, say, international business or maybe some of the other fields where this is newer, again, archives may still need greater introduction, more explanation, and it essentially just makes your method section longer, especially on the first couple of submissions. Now, if you go with oral history or something that they might consider semi-structured retrospective interviewing, well, that might be fine because they're very familiar with that sort of thing. So to think that this is a radically new thing you're offering them, I think we need to be a bit careful. However, oral history, again, the traditions are different, and also oral history normally uses named protagonists, and you may be using oral histories that you yourself did not collect. So it's something that they would consider secondary data in management journals. And it's worthwhile highlighting that there's some pitfalls to that you may need to consider from a methodological angle. And finally, you will have to forget about footnotes. Management journals do not like footnotes. You will have noticed, for example, business history is also moving away from footnotes. We started that process a long time ago, business history. 2018, we published an editorial about changing the referencing style. It's short, gives you examples how to do it. I would strongly suggest to look at how you use archival references in an in-text Harvard-style citation. This one looks particularly at APA, which is the American Psychological Association. And gotta say it, it's entirely possible to cite archival work without footnotes. And that little piece should tell you how. So that's the end of this talk. I hope this was useful. I thought it might be a nice break from having something written. If you have any comments, any suggestions, any questions, do please post it in the comments. And yeah, do spread the word about the Organizational History Network. Thank you.